Hello, you're watching Context, where we discuss key developments of wider global and regional magnitude. And I'm Orkhan Amashov here to ask some pertinent questions for the sake of understanding the essence of what is happening across the globe. Against the backdrop of peace talks on Ukraine, one of the key themes discussed is one related to possible ways to lift sanctions on Russia as part of the broader normalization efforts between Washington and Moscow. Earlier this week, the United States conducted separate negotiations with Russia and Ukraine, achieving an understanding between these two countries on the elimination of the use of force in the Black Sea. The Kremlin later confirmed that the implementation of this agreement was contingent on the removal of some international economic restrictions currently imposed on Moscow. In the meantime, because the question of the removal of those punitive measures remains a key leveraging tool that European countries could still effectively employ and use against Moscow, this also requires consensus between Washington and the European Union. And the latter, the European Union, remains of the view that it is much too early to be discussing any sanctions relief in connection with Russia. Interestingly enough, the position maintained by the United Kingdom, a key US ally, which is apparently treading a tightrope in an effort to maintain its support for Ukraine without undermining this special relationship with the United States, is that Western sanctions on Russia need to be increased, not weakened, in order to bring Moscow to the negotiating table. So Keir Starmer has said this particular statement very recently. In the midst of this apparent chasm within the transatlantic alliance, one wonders to what extent actually some apparent differences between London and Washington are actually aimed at producing the combined effect that would compel Russia to agree to a deal with Ukraine that would be the best possible deal for this country. On the other hand, the major question is, are we currently actually observing the very inception of that which could be described as bringing Russia in from the cold? The subject of sanctions relief is one that should see the US, UK and European Union cooperate, and as far as one can tell on the basis of available information, Europe and the United States do not seem to act in line regarding this very important matter. And joining me today to discuss this very interesting subject, John Kavalik, Senior Editor at Inside Issue, and also Mr. Oleksiy Haran, a professor from Kyiv University. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Hello. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining. Mr. Kavalik, what we have here, it looks like, is US intention to ease sanctions on Russia. This is one element which is easily discernible, identifiable. We also have collective European position aimed at producing collective response to US intention. As far as one can tell, on the basis of externally visible and observable, that's what we see. How does the situation look like to you?
I think it looks as you've explained it. There are, rather than the degrees of differences becoming less and the distance between the positions of the Trump-Vance administration and then individual members of the European Union, individual members of NATO, and then collectively the European Union, the distance is growing greater. And that's primarily the result that President Trump is laser focused on one aspect of the Russian-Ukraine war, and that is the implementation of the ceasefire, because with that, he believes that he can then say he's delivered on his promise, which is stop young, handsome men from dying. And the challenge is that Europe, European Union, NATO, they look at the ceasefire as just a component and even a micro component of other components. And so they're, as long as those two perspectives exist, and they exist in parallel and in tandem, and they exist in perpendicular one another, it's going to be challenging for the EU to move toward President Trump and for President Trump toward the EU. So I think what we're going to have are basically two different pathways, and they're both going to be implemented simultaneously, and no one's going to be happy about it.
I see. Well, British Prime Minister, Professor, this question to you. British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer recently said that it's vital to increase sanctions on Russia in order to, amongst other things, support the US initiative. So UK position seems to be that in order to help US convince Russia agree on something reasonable, a coalition of civilians led by the United Kingdom and France should ramp up pressure on Russia. What is your evaluation of the current situation? Mr. Kavalik earlier said that we have two different pathways, but eventually perhaps we will see some convergence. But currently we see this chasm which is obvious to many. What is your reading of the situation, sir?
Whom are you talking? Are you talking to me?
Yes, I'm talking to you, sir. That's a question to you, Professor.
Okay. Look, first of all, actually, I'm very thankful to you that you showed, just before your questions, you showed the videos of what's going on in Ukraine. Continued bombardments. Okay? Actually, both the US and Ukraine suggested that we have full-scale ceasefire. Russia refused. Then we are coming to two ceasefires. One ceasefire is declared on the Black Sea. The other is declared not to attack the energy infrastructures. And if you see what's going on, Russia violating everything. So they continue bombardments every day. Every day they are bombarding ports on the Black Sea. Every day they are bombarding energy infrastructures throughout the whole Ukraine. And every day they are bombarding civilians. 3 days ago, there was a missile attack on the center of one region, which name is Sumy. 100 people were wounded, including 5 children, right? So were no military objects at all. So Russia do not perform any ceasefires. Instead, they are raising stakes by declaring, okay, you need to raise your sanctions. Tell me, please, what Russia did in order to lift at least partial sanctions, at least partially. What Russia did to that? The answer is nothing. Nothing. That's the problem. So actually, and that's usual Russian tactics. Everything was predicted. So basically, if we want Russia to stick to ceasefire, it's necessary to increase sanctions, not. I assume the Trump administration is thinking in the different direction, okay? But actually Trump said that, okay, we push Ukraine and then we will push Russia. So they pushed Ukraine, we agreed to 30 days full-scale ceasefire, and Russia didn't. So why should anybody lift the sanctions? It would be an appeasement of aggressor, full stop. The sanctions were introduced as a result of Russian aggression, as a result of bombardments of civilians throughout the whole Ukraine, and because of occupation of part of Ukrainian territory. That's why they were introduced. Anything changed? Unfortunately not.
Mr. Kavalik, Professor Harand believes that lifting sanctions would be tantamount to appeasement. What do you make of the list of Russian demands proposed as sort of prerequisites for their implementation of the Black Sea deal? Apparently, the demands include revoking sanctions on the State Agricultural Bank, I think it's one of those demands, and also restoring the firm's access to the SWIFT international payment system. What do you make of these demands? Do you find them reasonable at this juncture? Because as I understand, you made it very clear during our last conversation that from the perspective of Trump administration, ceasefire negotiations is one track, peace negotiations involving sanctions-related matters a completely different track. Please.
What the Russian Federation's demanding in terms of reconnecting to some banks to SWIFT, as well as assistance in exporting commodities from within the Black Sea, is from their playbook of 2022 and 2023. They asked the same when they were involved in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and then when they pulled out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So not surprising that they're bringing that up again. The professor's absolutely right in terms of the timeline that he drew out, and I was in Sumy not too long ago, so I know what he's talking about in terms of the destruction. What I just don't see happening, and regardless of what's right or wrong, I just don't see happening is administration moving very aggressively from its position to more embrace the positions of Prime Minister Starmer in the UK, Macron, the coalition of the willing, because President Trump is, his perspective on this is, how do I end it and then get us out of it? And so, that narrative that he has, and then that comes up against President Putin's narrative, which is, does he still want Ukraine? Yes. Does he recognize that it's not likely he can get what he originally wanted in 22? Yes. But he still controls roughly 20% of the country and still can continue to make demands because, from his perspective, he's not going to give it back, and the president isn't demanding he give it back. And he also is probably right in terms of what we've seen happen since 2022, it's now 4 years with the European Union and even with NATO members, is they talk very tough, leadership talks very tough, but then when it gets down to actually implementing the decisions that they've talked tough about, there's a lot of distance there. President Putin sees it. President Trump sees it. President Zelensky absolutely sees it, and he talks about it. But there you have now these three narratives, and so I expect that President Putin's going to continue to ask different things. He's brought up now this proposal about elections in Ukraine being supervised by the United Nations, a transitional government. And that's not going to go anywhere. And he knows that's not going to go anywhere, but sort of throw it out there. It's right now going to be President Trump. And it's more about, and President Zelensky has mentioned this, President Trump needs to be convinced that President Putin is embarrassing him, that is making him foolish, making him look dumb, making him look stupid, making him used, having them start saying the same thing. And that's what the Europeans, President Zelensky, is hoping can then trigger President Trump to move toward the rest of them. But right now, that isn't happening. President Trump is still giving a lot of rope to President Putin to try to get what President Trump wants, which is that ceasefire implemented.
Professor Haran, fundamentally speaking, we're talking about possible sanction reliefs. You say that you believe that sanctions should stay in force, they should not be lifted. But fundamentally, why do you think those sanctions imposed fundamentally by European Union, by the United Kingdom, which were still described as crippling sanctions, fundamentally have failed to produce the desired debilitating effect for Russia? Because for all of its problems, Russia is still alive and still in a sense functioning mode. Why do you think they have failed to produce the result which they were supposed to produce in the first place?
Firstly, the sanctions were not strong enough. They were, there was a gradual increase of these sanctions. Actually, I don't in a good situation. Otherwise, why Putin is asking all the time, lift sanctions, lift sanctions. He's not in a good situation. Frontline actually is, there is a slow Russian advancement, but basically the situation is stalled. Okay, so Russian economy is not in a good shape. That and Putin is putting forward crazy and crazier things, like just I believe today or yesterday, he said about governance on external governance of Ukraine through the UN or something like that. Why? Tell me, please. Why is it so crazy? We are independent, sovereign country. We are democratic country. It's not for dictator to teach us how to live and then conduct elections. But Putin is moving, he's putting it forward and forward. In this situation, I fully agree with President Trump's approach. Okay, actually now he's behaving like a mediator. Okay, so he's pushing Ukraine. Okay, fine, but he's also, but then it's very logical that he will push all. Let's see how it will go on. Because again, Russia did nothing at all after two ceasefires, because there are two parallel ceasefires, Black Sea and energy infrastructure. And he's continuing bombardments. If you lift sanctions, again, what's that? Isn't it a reward of aggression? Yes, it is. It will look like appeasement of aggression. And actually, President Trump in this situation would look as weak. Okay, so frankly speaking, for us experts in Ukraine, we consider that sooner or later, Trump is to make some strong decisions to show that he's not going to be deceived by Russians. This is usual Russian tactics, to involve into something, then to increase the stakes, to put more conditions, and then trying, to gain what Russia wants, not the mediator, not the victim of aggression. So that's the point.
Thank you. Mr. Kavalnik, we realize that there are those in Ukraine and also in different European capitals and amongst some Democrats in the United States, those who would say that actually Russia's situation is very bad and Western countries should continue this process of putting massive pressure on Russia up to the point Russia will be weakened to the point of saying that Russia is ready to sign a deal with Ukraine on Ukrainian terms. There are those who would still argue in the self-same fashion. You earlier mentioned about ceasefire and peace negotiations being separate. So Prime Minister Starmer, I want to go back to his statement. He said that the plan of the coalition of the willing is to increase the economic pressure on Russia, accelerate new tougher sanctions, bearing down on Russia's energy revenues, and working together to make this pressure count. Does this rhetoric emanating from London help Donald Trump or not? Because Russians have been traditionally complaining about the undue British influence on the decision-making process in Washington, D.C. Now the Prime Minister of a country, which is a key US ally, is talking about increasing pressure, whereas Trump is trying to achieve some sort of ceasefire deal in Ukraine. I'm still interested about to what extent there's an element of coordination in this effort.
Sort of the good cop, bad cop, or the bad and badder cop. And the Russian Federation took the same position when Prime Minister Boris Johnson, was in 10 Downing Street, where it was Boris Johnson that derailed decisions in early 2022, and so they're not happy with the UK at all. A good number of oligarchs have had billions and billions of dollars assets frozen. The UK courts have gone after them, so it's they've been aggressive. The professor is absolutely right in terms of the sanctions. One of the reasons that the approach, and now that the coalition of the willing is saying we're going to put more sanctions on collectively. The EU is looking at a number 16, or I think it's number 17 sanctions package. But the reason, the professor said absolutely right, the sanctions have been like a rheostat. They weren't an on-off switch where there was a massive amount of sanctions turned on all at once. And as my background, I've had a lot of experience with Cuba. Cuba's been under sanctions from the U.S. for 65 years. One of the reasons that sanctions generally don't work is because countries under sanctions all talk to one another. They all interact with one another, and they basically talk to each other by saying, how are you getting around this one? How are you getting one? And there are always going to be countries that are going to help another country get around sanctions, whether US or EU. And in the case of Russia, China's been a big help. Iran's been a big help. North Korea's been a big help. India's been a big help. The EU countries in the EU continue to purchase, although a small amount, of products from Russia. The US continues to purchase a little bit. So they've got enough where there is a slow decline in the economy, but slow decline. It's not a steep decline. And as long as that trajectory remains, the Russian Federation has power. So, when Prime Minister Starmer is saying, President Trump, with all due respect, don't give them any breathing room in order to get something you want, because they're just going to keep asking for more breathing room. So you've got to get tough. You've got to let us take the lead and then follow us. The problem is President Trump doesn't like to follow people. He likes people to follow him.
Professor Haram, I would just like to pose my last question to you. Of course, there are a number of countries helping Russia. Even a tiny country in the South Caucasus, Armenia, due to being a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, has been instrumental in terms of circumvention of sanctions levied against Moscow. There are many helpers there. My last question to you, Professor, is this. Yeah.
Armenia now actually is leaving Russia.
Yeah.
Because Russia is pressuring Armenia. So this is the case.
Yeah, Armenia
is not just...
Armenia is leaving Russia, but Armenia is a member of the Russia-dominated customs Eurasian Economic Union, and has been advertently or inadvertently instrumental, acting as a conduit for circumvention of sanctions levied against Russia. My last question to you. In Russia, as I'm sure you know, this term is very popular, collective West. Collective, they always talk about West as a collective entity. Do you think after what happened on the 28th of February, after what happened at the UN when United States sided with Russia against UK and France, this term, collective West, is still legitimate to use?
Well, now it's difficult. Look, US and Europe still remains as allies, and Europe doesn't want to destroy this alliance, and hopefully Trump will not also lead US out of NATO. But definitely this unity, transatlantic partnership, but definitely it's decreasing. It's not as strong as it was before. Actually, nobody expected that Trump would do that so quickly. But look, for me, what is important, again, following this discussion, well, I understand that Trump is saying, okay, I would like to embrace Russia. But Russia behaves in such a way that it's violating. They're actually pushing Mr. Trump out of ceasefire, out of negotiations. So they are putting their own demands, additional demands. So I think at a certain point, the sanctions should be increased. Whether Trump will do that or not, we are not sure. Logically, from what he said, even before start of negotiations, logically he should react to that, because it would be just. Okay, because Russia is violating everything, again, even those ceasefires which recently were agreed in Saudi Arabia. Again, if one side is continuing the war, is killing civilians, okay, is violating the terms of negotiation, what should be done? Lifting sanctions or vice versa. The first case, I would repeat, this is appeasement. This would be appeasement of aggressor. Putin is trying to do that. Okay, the question is for United States and for President Trump how they would react to that.
John Kavalik.
Because Russian.
Sorry, please. Your last words, Professor.
Okay. Because Russian aims are the same. It's not even about territory. It's about crushing Ukraine as a nation. Putin has said on many occasions that Ukrainians do not exist. I do not exist as a Ukrainian, only if I recognize that I am Russian. Okay, so these are the aims of Putin, not the territories. So let's be clear about that.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much indeed. John Kavalik, Senior Editor at Issue Insight, and Professor Alexei Aran, Professor of Kiev University. I'm so grateful to both of you for your time and for your detailed answers. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. This was John Kavalik, senior editor at Issue Insight, and Professor Oleksiy Haran, professor from Kiev University. We discussed the latest discussions revolving around whether the sanctions currently imposed on Russia should be lifted or not, to what extent it will be beneficial for the transatlantic alliance, what is the degree of commonality that is driving these two forces, and what will happen next in Ukraine. See you very soon indeed.